Good morning, everyone. I want to thank you all for braving the elements. I see some of you have really come in soaked to the skin, and in this design in the time of displacement, we should be able to design some type of better weather system, I suppose, for our summits. I know a lot of you have traveled far. My dear friend Jan is even here from Darfur. So thank you all for making this. It's with great pleasure that I welcome you to our second Design for Humanity Summit. The Institute of International Humanitarian Affairs reports directly to the president of the university and creates a bridge between humanitarian assistance and academia. We have an undergraduate program, 2 master's programs, and 3 areas of research, of which Design for Humanity is one. So Design for Humanity, Education in Emergencies, and Humanitarian Innovations. The Institute also has its own gallery with 3 to 4 shows per year, and a press where it publishes stories on humanitarian issues. The yearbook for last year's summit, held last summer in partnership with IOM and the Permanent Mission of Ireland to the United Nations, is available to you in printed and electronic form. And I urge you to read it to see really where we were, where we are today, and where we may be going. This world we live in calls out for a humanistic approach. We know that as of this week, global displacement has topped 70 million people. And our design research fellow, Alberto Priato, is now part of the IOM team that is responding to the Venezuelan crisis. And so, again, where thousands of men, women, and children are pouring over the borders into Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil every day. And I'm thankful that he has taken the time to come up for a day to be here with us. We gather here today, a year after the inaugural summit, to further build and provoke, seeking commonalities between humanitarians and designers alike. Our institute continues to support and advocate for those looking at dignified, ethical solutions to global complex problems. This summit, therefore, builds on the knowledge of the year before and is influenced by the developments of the year before. We again welcome aid professionals, academics, students, and friends to a day of panels, workshops, and innovative discussions. I'd like to especially welcome the International Diploma in Humanitarian Assistance program, now at the end of its 3rd week, a difficult 3rd week. I exhort you to all apply all you've learned and all of the personal experiences that you've already shared this month in this day as well. As the director of the Institute, it falls upon me to thank the people who are critical in making this day. And first among them, Alberto Priato, who is the Institute's Design Research Fellow, and the co-organizer of this day, Angela Wells, the other co-organizer, who is with the emergency team in IOM and was last year with the Institute. So it's a family reunion of types. It was Alberto and Angela who really made reality out of our common dreams. And I'm so grateful to them for that, and especially in this complicated year, for giving their time and energy. Camille Giacovis, our Communications and Research Officer, took a new leadership role in this area, and with characteristic intelligence and energy, has brought this day to fruition. I'd like to thank all the interns who were with us today. But perhaps most of all, I'd like to thank our critical and key partner, IOM, for their continued faith and interest in this important area. This begins really with Argentina Sábados, who many years ago urged us to formalize the informal relationship that we had developed with IOM and steered us really to this moment. I'd like to thank Richard Blewitt, a permanent observer of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies to the United Nations, for agreeing to come today to deliver the second keynote. His friendship and his guidance are so appreciated. Brian Kelly will be leading the first panel, is someone who has moved this project forward since the very beginning, since over a year ago. Amy Goodman, you will hear from Amy this afternoon, is someone who's really interested in what we're trying to do, and I'm hoping that this is the first of many interactions that the Institute will have with Democracy Now! We have dreams. In short, we are committed to creating a community of practitioners and scholars passionate about developing a charter for humanitarian design, a charter based on an ethical framework that guides future design interventions in humanitarian settings. The more this humanitarian design network grows, the more imperative these connections are between and across sectors. During the 2018 summit, we explored the intersection of design and humanitarian action for human dignity. Dialogues on public interest design and design in the time of rapid onset emergency then went into the role of the private sector in improving humanitarian design. And those insights and notes you'll find chronicled in the yearbook. We will build upon those today. The theme of this summit is design in the time of displacement. This number, as I mentioned, is now, the number of displaced has risen over the last 2 years from 68 million to 70 million and is going up. There are 31 people newly displaced every minute of the day. Displacement is not time-bound, but is instead transient, unstable, and fraught with paradox, as structures and environments are often temporary to what can sometimes be a permanent solution for the displaced. Welcome to this day, and welcome to this ongoing examination of how to be better, how to always be better in approach to the care of our vulnerable brothers and sisters. Thank you. I now want to welcome our humanitarian keynote speaker, Argentina Sábados. Tina is the regional director of IOM in Southeastern Europe, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. She has been a friend of mine and of ours for nearly 20 years, since we were in our teens. An alumna of our IDHA program, IDHA 2. She is now, we were talking before, one of 3 regional directors who are alumni of the IDHA, regional directors in IOM. Tina is always busy, always traveling, always meeting with government officials to look at the migration issues that beset Eastern, Southeastern Europe, and Central Asia. And she made time out of her schedule to come here to New York, and I'm thrilled to see her, I'm thrilled to be with her, and I'm thrilled to learn from her. Tina.
Thank you very much, Brendan, and good morning to you all. It is indeed a privilege and a pleasure to be here with you all again, to be in New York, a city that I love so much, and moreover, to be with Fordham, the university that I have been affiliated with for more than 2 decades. Even more to be around with so many familiar faces, our good old friends around, the alumni and the professors and the teachers. It's really wonderful to be here. It is wonderful to open the second Design for Humanitarian Summit of the Institute of the International Humanitarian Affairs. And it's a little bit by chance that I opened the second one. I was not here for the first one. But for those of you who are not here for the first one, I would like to tell you the story, how it all began. It began with an IDHA course and a graduate. He was so inspired by the atmosphere, by the knowledge, by the wish to have more and to make a change. Then he was going on and on until the first summit has been implemented. And his name is Alberto Peato. I think he earns a round of applauses. Alberto, as you heard, is working with IOM. He works in emergency areas. He always worked in emergency areas. So it's an IOM Senior Regional Program Coordinator. And in addition, he made another name and another function. And it's not because he has nothing better to do. And he is the visiting humanitarian design fellow and co-organizer of the Design for Humanity Summit. Now, you heard from Brendan that few of us, IDHA graduates, IDHA alumni, do make a little advancement in our career. Indeed, in IOM, we do have about 18,000 people, including consultants and interns, out of which we distribute them in 9 areas, in 9 regions. Out of the current 9 regional directors of IOM, 3 of them, we are IDHA graduates. So thanks to Brendan for keeping on the courses. And we do hope that it's going to be the fate for all of you that you will become important and your word and voice will be heard at the highest level. So what do we do today? We do have 2 dialogues and multiple workshops. And I know that what is expected is that you will all share as much as you can, but we will also listen as much as you can. And Brendan is expecting us to, at the end, to have the magic and to do a change. So let's aim for making this important summit changing, and changing for good. I do have 3 points to mention throughout my little contribution today. First, I would like to create a humanitarian timeline. I see in the rooms many friends of mine for 2, 3, or 4 decades of humanitarian work. And the question that probably we will need to put throughout the day is, do we make a difference? What is the difference that we all were doing since 30 years ago? What is the difference that we do for the last 20, for the last 10, for the last 5, or since last month? Are we able to make a difference? Are we able to make a change? Second, I would like to challenge you with the factors of temporary occupied spaces. It says in the program that speakers will focus on the physical dimension of the spaces temporarily inhabited or occupied by people on the move, spaces of mobility, transition, refuge, and permanence. Now, these occupied spaces are homes, and are homes for the most vulnerable one. And third, I would like to concentrate a little bit on the data, which is one of the biggest challenge and also opportunity that we do have today. Thanks to the data and the technology, we base our programs on reality, not guessworks or fake news or myths, but indeed realities. Also, we can't work in isolation. We do need everybody. We need the academia, we need the UN, the civil society, the private sector, the technical experts, the scientists, the designers, also the researchers, and many more. All together, we may have ideas, but ideas themselves would not make a difference until we come to a solution. And solutions will arise with vision, with humility, and with dialogue, a dialogue like we will have today. So dear friends and colleagues, today we are facing unprecedented opportunities. Humanitarians in the room, in particular those for a little while working on humanitarian issues, could have never dreamed of so many opportunities. I remember when I started 3 decades ago, I didn't know anything about how to collect data that it can be done by drones, or how to have maps, or how to have Google. In fact, we didn't even have internet. So we started from Biafra, we all say, and Cambodia in the 60s, and 70s to Ethiopia, 80s Somalia, then Chechnya, Rwanda, Yugoslavia in the 90s. Recent crises, Haiti, Philippines, Nepal, Ukraine, Syria. There are some protracted, some recurring situation, Iran, Afghanistan. And we also have dangerous routes that the migrants take through the Mediterranean, Rio Grande, Sahara, just to mention a few. And I'm deliberately mentioning the humanitarian timeline for you to consider, because indeed we have to ask ourselves every so often, are we doing better? And even if the answer is yes, the next question should be, are we leaving anyone behind? Because no one should be left behind. Every mass movement, every health crisis, every earthquake becomes a major event in the world news cycles for only 2 reasons. First, the number, and second, the degree of suffering. If you wish, news or crises or emergencies will not be in the news if the numbers are not high. And if you wish, it will not be in the news if the degree of suffering is low. And this is all judged by media. And we, of course, should not follow those, and we should respond where the needs are. But we have to be also realistic that the media, the geopolitics, the international attention do have a big say in how and where we are working. Now about the figures and the numbers. Indeed, as Brendan has been mentioning, 1 in 7 people live in a slum or a refugee camp. That's a fact. And more than 3 billion people, nearly half of the world's population, do not have access to clean water or adequate sanitation. So while we are making huge efforts against poverty in lifting people out of normal poverty, it seems that the number of people living in extreme poverty is rising at an alarming rate. And wars, disasters, fragility of living, in particular in megacities, are drivers for this rise. And this is our concern for today. How are we going to be having solutions for those? Where is the design? Where are the temporary inhabited spaces? Can we make the difference? Because if we do, it will be a difference that we can make between home or hell. I am certain that in every language that we all speak in this room, and probably we do speak quite a few, we all have the expression, no place like home. No place like home. Home is existential for all of us. In our minds, we can have everything there: the kitchen table, the bedroom, the bathroom, the kids playing, where the stair is cracking. We know everything about the home. But home is also the community. It's the language that we speak, the people, the services, the church, temple, or the mosque. It's a massive part of our identity, and to lose that because of a war, a drought, food, climate change, light side, earthquake, is one of the most profound shocks a human can experience. I would like you to introduce to Thomas. Thomas was born in what was then Sudan, and now forms part of the new nation of South Sudan. We'll have a photo, but if not, don't worry about it. It's just an example, because he has been in 2016 one of the 30,000 who had to leave the country and then to establish a camp on only 100,000 square meters of land. Now, designers will tell you, humanitarians, how big is that, okay? It's very small. And IOM had the challenge to make certain that these people can live, even on a small place, but in a dignified fashion. And it was Thomas who has been leading his block. And he was telling us, IOM, that if we put a roof, it should be the elephant grass, because the shade is going to be much better, and the plastic that it's underneath is going to be more protected. And he also taught us that bamboo walls and doors will provide privacy for the families, and as such, a durable solution for the shelters. Very simple, very sustainable, very maintainable, very ecologic, very environmental, and based on local knowledge. And of course, today we will speak about high-tech and high-spec solutions, but just to reinforce to all of us that often the answers are right in front of us. We just have to listen to them to get them. One of the most quoted phrases in humanitarian action is, "There is nothing more permanent than a temporary settlement." And you all understand what I speak about. We start with tents, and then the tents become huts, and the huts shacks, and then shacks become homes. And people often think that camps in Palestine, for example, are the oldest. Actually, it's not true. There is a camp for the last 72 years still operating. It's Cooper's Camp in West Bengal. It has been housing Hindus from what is now Bangladesh since 1947. We also know big camps like Kenya and Dadaab was opened 3 decades ago by your professor, Larry Hollingworth. Probably he didn't tell you. Modesty and humbleness. Another contributing factor to vulnerability of people, it's obviously to run when it's a trouble to the next place. So very often, as many of you have been studying, people will prefer to find a refuge near the place and would prefer to go back. But many of them cannot go back. Many of them cannot go further, so they are stuck there. But life cannot be put on hold. They will have marriages, babies, they will need a job, they will need schools, they will need health services, and they will settle. And they will settle still in the same camp where they were before. Before I move on to the subject of data, I wanted to leave you 2 images, if it works. So that you can see the difference. If it doesn't, I can describe. One is Kilis in Turkey, and what's described by the New York Times as the best refugee camp in the world. And you will see that it really looks the best. It's a solid building and probably have all the facilities. And the second, you do not see, but they are tents, and the tents are in the mud, and the children are around with their mother. And the second one I don't want to say where it is, but it is in Europe, and it's a disaster, and this is recent, and this is as we speak. So those are the differences. The age of data, again, without the data, we will be very lost. We wouldn't know how to address the needs of the people. But what's interesting is how sophisticated it became. It's not anymore us humanitarians going around in an isolated way, because our end users, the beneficiaries, would have the means to communicate with us or with each other directly or indirectly as they please. And also, the data is very democratic today, in particular the technology. So everyone can share in a democratic way whatever is needed. And that makes us more accountable, I think. And that's something probably that we'll also hear throughout the day. More accountable means that we do have even more responsibility for the masses, but also for the individual, for the subgroups and everything in between. Now we do have the authority to say not only how many, but also to say who. Are they women, children? What are their needs? So we can have very sophisticated collection of data. Just wanted to share with you one of the information report that we released on the 8th of March, which is the International Women's Day. We were recording with details in transit of almost 3 million people through 90 locations in West, Central, East, and Horn of Africa. And after we were looking at our selections and the data, we saw that it's 30% of those people were women. Now, I'm not speaking about percentages of women and men who are entrepreneurial and want to leave and want to have a migration path. The interesting thing was that women have their own migration paths. So remarkably, in the west of Libya, women go south, while men head north. So that was quite interesting. They didn't escape the men, and the men didn't escape the women. It was just job opportunities which would make them live in completely opposite directions. But speaking about numbers, we should not forget that it's not numbers. There are people around, there are people behind, and we should not have the numbers in isolation without thinking about the individuals. So conclusions, I firmly believe that today we do have around the greatest and the brightest mind, there's no question about that. People who can really make a difference towards ensuring the dignity and safety of the population in crisis. We are all here thanks to the long-lasting relationship and cooperation with Fordham University, IIHA, and IOM. And this relationship is expanding through this Design for Humanity initiative. And I have no doubt that the new generation, including the new IDHA graduates to be very soon, by the end of the week, and as well as all the participants will leave today with a better knowledge, with having inspiration, being more innovative, deeping into the research, and in general, the education, it's gonna be strengthened for a juster and probably a more inclusive world. Because we indeed need a change, and we may not be able, in spite that we try to change the world, but what we are able is to change the whole world for an individual. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tina. I think that's a fantastic way of beginning. My next speaker is Richard Blewitt. Richard Blewitt is the head of delegation and permanent representative for the IFRC to the United Nations here in New York. Richard's background is not just Red Cross. He comes also as the former CEO for HelpAge, which looked at one of the vulnerable populations, which is the aged, and very often overlooked, as well as from within the UN system, where he was the resident representative down in the Caribbean. More than that, he's been a great friend to us here in New York, to the Institute, looking at ways in which the Federation and the Institute can work on practical problems. And he's been a lecturer for us. We see more and more opportunities there in reaching disparate groups. So I'd like to welcome Richard to deliver the second keynote of the morning. Thank you.
Okay, very good morning, everybody. I'm going to put my stopwatch on just to make sure I'm not terribly ill-disciplined. Tina, IOM, firstly, thank you very much for the leadership and partnership with Fordham. And Fordham, Brendan, you know, it's very inspiring to have the chance to come and be here today. Earlier, like Brendan said, I met the IDHA students, which are a fantastic group of professionals committed to making the humanitarian space more effective and impactful. So I'm going to talk about, hopefully I'm going to be on topic. Firstly, I want to start with the notion, a bit like Tina was saying, what do we all want? We all want, in the context of design and our homes, we want safety and protection. And yet a lot of people on the move don't have safety and protection. We all want some level of integration. We want some level of belonging in the spaces where we exist. I want that here in New York as we try and find some new friends here. But people want it even in very difficult circumstances. We want to be able to be self-reliant. We want to find a way to make a living, and so that we can actually give and support our children to go to school and that they can access basic health care. And then we want access to some form of basic services. Even displaced persons, on-the-move persons want access and need access to basic services. What are some of the challenges? Well, we have obviously, I think, a very strong evidence base now about the climate crisis fueling the movement of people. And that's just going to get worse and more complicated as the years go by. If we take an example, the climate crisis is affecting people's livelihoods in the Lake Chad region, and they're forced to move in very difficult circumstances, and where they turn up also remains food insecure and problematic. We're now in a world where hunger is started to rise again. From last year, the hunger numbers started to go in the wrong direction, which is obviously very alarming. We have a lot of people on the move who are dealing with and living in tremendous uncertainty and insecurity. I mean, from the extremes of Yemen to Central African Republic, which is very problematic. And then we've got an emergence of different types of what does community really mean anymore? And that represents both opportunity and constraint. Many people on the move have mobile phones. They're connected to their relatives who haven't moved. That presents opportunities to give them some level of comfort and connectivity and support. Okay, so one thing, the Federation took on a responsibility 14 years ago, I was at the Federation, to co-lead the shelter cluster for the humanitarian sector. I was very keen for the Federation to do that at the time because I believed that it was an area that needed improvement, investment, support. The Federation had a long history through its national societies working on shelter issues in its 100 years, and so we went to do it. I then asked the current head of the shelter cluster for the Federation, who supports all the organizations working on shelter around the world. When I rejoined the Federation, I asked her, what's the story? 13 years on, what happened? And she gave me a very dramatic piece of information that relates to money. So firstly, shelter is the lowest funded part of the humanitarian machinery. Money does not go to shelter. Secondly, there's very, very little money for recovery and self-recovery. So you have all these ideas in Mozambique, we're going to build back better, or in Dominica, we're going to be the first climate-smart island in the world. But the gap between the rhetoric and the actual reality is absolutely astronomical. The money isn't there to do that in a meaningful way, and even to support people to do their own self-recovery properly. Donors often think shelter is expensive. Another constraint, and maybe that's misplaced. There are ways that shelter doesn't need to be expensive if you involve the people themselves in the processes and help them work on their shelter challenges. We need to understand, one of the things the Red Cross movement is working on is greening our humanitarian action. So we're sending specialists to make sure that we're doing the right thing. We've just sent a specialist to Mozambique at the request of the Mozambique government to work on asbestos. So a lot of the buildings that got damaged in the crisis had asbestos in them, and that needs to be safely disposed of as part of the early recovery activity. So that whole question of greening the humanitarian response, I think, is going to be incredibly important in the future. Obviously, urbanization is a massive global trend and presents a whole set of challenges and vulnerabilities. We have the issue of people on the move, literally moving, and what are you going to do to present and offer shelter solutions to people who are moving through Central America on their way potentially to the United States or to other locations? And one of the things we're very passionate about is how do you provide humanitarian service points where they feel they can go into a physical location and feel they can access services without being arrested or intimidated. How do you also have service points that are connecting persons who are displaced with local populations and providing basic support to them so that you don't isolate the displaced or the refugees outside the context within which they're trying to live? On Building Back Better, I most recently was in the Caribbean and I had to go and do some Building Back Better in St. Martin. St. Martin is a very small Dutch non-independent island. Abramovich's boat goes there. So if you want to talk about design, there's a very extreme example of very wealthy people. But it has two challenges. A quarter of the population of St. Martin are illegals. So many of them, when the disaster hit, they had to leave St. Martin, but then they just come back because they've got to make a living. And they live in the shadows, they have no access to proper services, hard for the UN to reach them. They lived in the most terrible accommodation that was affected by the hurricane that flew over St. Martin. And then on Building Back Better, I was with UNDP at the time, that was one of my responsibilities, and we got into the issue of fixing people's houses. And to fix the roof in line with really a Build Back Better solution for older people and other vulnerable people cost $12,000. That made the Dutch government go apoplectic because they said, we're not spending $12,000 on a roof in St. Martin. We'll spend $2,000. And so we ended up with a very, very tense, problematic issue, whereas the real solution to make sure that when the next Hurricane 5 comes, the roof doesn't blow off is A, but actually no one wants to pay for A. The government wants to set the guidelines and the policy, which is sensible for the long term, but actually the investment necessary to do that isn't there. And then, of course, what you witness is poor people in St. Martin were anyhow just fixing their roofs in the same bad way that has no resilience to the next hurricane. So, the real world was next to our intervention. Okay, so I want to talk a bit about the Federation's approach to shelter. So firstly, this is and our involvement in the shelter cluster. We take a principled approach on the built environment, recruiting professionals who really know what they're talking about. That's a big priority for us, people who have technical qualifications. We have a lot of built environment and design professionals working in our teams, partly because of the liability issues, but also because we know that they bring an expertise to improve the quality of the shelter responses that we do. Our approaches to shelter and settlement programs favors a process approach, not product. We've been there and done that. Product, bring the solution and it will be the solution. Our experience over many years is that that doesn't work, and it can be a lot of wasted money and resources that doesn't deliver the results for people. So we want to work very much with populations that are affected and enable them to look at incremental expansion and improvement of their shelter options, and that they are in the driving seat, not us. We're obviously talking particularly about natural disasters. That's our core mandate and area of work. We believe design and innovation can make our responses better and help us face up to new challenges that come our way. That's why we remain always open to new ideas. However, this needs to be supported by people's own agency. It needs to be local. We strongly see the value and importance of local. And you can see, for instance, in Indonesia after Sulawesi, the government of Indonesia stopped the international machine flying into Indonesia because basically Indonesia can manage its own affairs. Whether they did a perfect job or not is another matter. The issue is that increasingly governments are not going to have the global machinery just turning up with its answers. They're going to say, we have Indonesian answers to Indonesian challenges. Please work with us, not. So we actually seconded shelter specialists to the government to help them work through with the communities improvements to the shelter solutions. We believe that disasters can provide us with elusive windows of opportunity to better plan with communities to improve their building practices, and that we need to take advantage of this by providing appropriate technical support in a timely and effective way. This requires a thorough understanding of the local context and how people live, and again, we should not be forcing a process with imported or our own ideas or technologies. We need to be mindful that behavioral change takes a long time, and innovation is an iterative process. Therefore, we may not be achieving what we think in the short term, everything that we would love to achieve. One of the funding challenges that Ella spoke to me about when I asked her about the Shelter Challenge was that we always get these annualized funding for humanitarian action that is completely disconnected from the long and difficult periods of time people are living in contexts. They may live in a camp in South Sudan or in a displaced context for 10 years, and yet we're doing this annual response and annual framing, which is completely, so we need to link the development and the humanitarian in a much more effective way. Okay, I now want to go to touch on the question of, I want to go to the Pacific, and I asked, we have a shelter delegate in the Pacific, and I asked him to give me his view of what's going on there and how is he addressing some of the challenges he's facing. So I'm going to sort of give you a sense of some of his work. He leads and supports the shelter cluster. He's worked for 15 years in the whole humanitarian shelter agenda. So when addressing shelter, he highlights we need to, the needs of people, we should focus on process. So he reiterates the kind of federation policy line. Shelter process that people follow before disaster, the process that responds to their need. We should look at emergency response, but also enabling factors to contribute to the household and the community's self-recovery. Having a product thinking might be more harmful, even if it has goodwill. We should reinforce people's own resilience, providing products that might not be appropriate we must avoid. And when looking at shelter, non-specialists often think that we should build something by ourselves. And this is understandable, but it might hamper future resilience, a future resilience agenda. This is indeed different in displaced response, but principles are somehow the same. Importing a fancy new product all in a box might reduce the capacity for people to contribute to their shelter process. And investing in local knowledge, practices, local economy might have a greater impact. Obviously, we believe that the shelter approach needs to be replicable, in the sense that often humanitarian response is serving only a tiny proportion of the need on the ground. Sometimes humanitarians kind of believe they're fixing everything, but actually that's not the reality. Remittances currently globally is bigger than all ODA, development ODA or humanitarian ODA. So, people are finding ways to exist and live and sort out their problems, and the humanitarian framework is only part of their answer. Replication is not here about capacity of people to replicate by buying materials to reproduce the same. We need to be culturally appropriate. It needs to fit the sort of economic agenda, and then it needs to be understandable with proper guidance provided to those that are going to be finding their shelter solutions. And then he shared an example. So the example is about tarpaulin and innovation. He said, this is a really powerful example. It's the fruit of extensive research with lots of stakeholders from humanitarian and industry stakeholders. For a relatively low cost, it's one of the main items used in humanitarian response worldwide. It's versatile, and it helps a lot of people contribute to their shelter process. It's a simple 4x6 piece of evolved plastic sheeting, and it has two sides. One is light gray in color, and the other one is dark gray, with reinforced black lines to support fixings. The question he asked is how many people know that only one side of the plastic sheeting is treated? So if we don't provide information and awareness, how many people misuse and don't understand the value of a simple thing like a plastic sheet? And if they use it wrong, it reduces its lifespan, it's not so effective as a shelter solution. Another example he gave was around a hackathon that he was involved with, where with CERN in Geneva in 2016, the idea was, bring great thinkers to come up with 48 hours, some really interesting solutions linked to 3D printing technology to develop brand new product shelters after disasters. So he and another shelter specialist were in this meeting. Lots of smart people, and the projects they developed was to respond to the ongoing crisis in Europe. They were analyzing the way that innovation could contribute to sheltering processes of migrants and the capacity of citizens in their hosting cities. And basically, he found some innovation out of that process, but also a set of limits to how the experts were really doing the work. Okay, so many architects and professionals are developing innovative shelter solutions. What we need to find a way is linking all that specialist knowledge to the ground in a way that gets durable and effective solutions. And I am going to finish there and say thank you very much.
So odd to say, but we're going to take a short break. I mean, we're going to set up for the first panel. So there's a coffee break, and we're going to begin at 10:30, aren't we? So give yourselves a chance to dry out, but return here at 10:30. Thanks.
All right, welcome back. I'm just going to spend a few words to introduce the moderator of the first dialogue of today, from camps to community. His name is Brian Kelly. He's a colleague in IOM. Is the head of the Community Stabilization Unit here in IOM, Washington, D.C. For the past, he asked me to say 2 decades, but I'm sure it's more. He has been coordinating IOM emergency responses in pretty much all the crises that happened in the past 2 decades. Whenever there is a crisis, IOM is usually there. Whenever there is a big crisis, then Brian is there. So thank you for being with us today.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Alberto, a colleague I've had the pleasure of working with multiple occasions before. Just to begin, thanks to Fordham University for the Institute for International Humanitarian Affairs, and particular thanks to Brendan for all the efforts in moving this forward. Our session is about from camps to communities, and we could almost change the name from communities to camps to communities, because everybody starts somewhere and they don't start in a camp. A space designed to be temporary, so often not. And we're going to really talk about how can design contribute to more prepared and resilient communities within these displacement settings. And I'm just really glad we've got an excellent panel with Raul, Jan, Johan, and Lauren that are at the table here. You know, for myself, I've done a lot of disaster response, like many of the panelists that we have, and in short, I'm a humanitarian aid worker. And I just want to, before we start going to the panelists, just a couple quick stories, and then a little bit of information about displacement. But I remember this is a few years ago in Afghanistan, and I was at a forward operating base of the U.S. military, and I was sitting with a colonel, and we were walking around the base, and the colonel was telling me how to engage communities. And then he was telling me about how we should support local governance, and how we're going to deal with people in displacement, and how we're going to set up IDP camps. So I'm listening to that, and I start telling him, I'm like, you know, I think that your guns should be over there, and your field of fire, the cover doesn't seem to be perfect. I think you need to build something over there. And he says, there was a terrified major who was in between. He's like, stay in your lane. I said, well, sir, stay in yours. And so what's the lane of design? And that's the point of that story. When we do a surge response, we're grabbing logisticians, security officers, deep field. We've got all these, but how are we incorporating people who have the design experience to be able to extract that from communities? How are we making this event relevant? And I'm really happy about the afternoon sessions as well, because we're going to be able to unpack some more of these things. Because we want to be impactful. And it was our regional director from IOM, Tina, who had spoken, and she used the phrase unprecedented opportunities. And that's so true, but normally that phrase is connected unprecedented crisis. But this is unprecedented opportunity. And how are we going to utilize that opportunity? And it gets me back to that forward operating base in Afghanistan, where then the colonel and I we ended up becoming actually fairly good friends. He started complaining about the issue that he was dealing with, which was that then the colonels and others were coming for the day trips on their helicopters to his forward operating base, and was saying, hey, maybe you should do this. What about this idea? Don't you think it would be better if you did this? You should follow up on that. They get on their helicopter and go back to Kabul. He called them the good idea fairy. And it was interesting. You know, so how do we make sure that we're impactful? How do we make sure that we get integrated in a response with people affected by the response at the center of it? You know, unfortunately, we have a lot of opportunities to try this. You know, if we go from West Africa with pushes from Boko Haram to Central Africa with the current Ebola crisis to East Africa with the outflows from Somalia and the issues going on in Ethiopia, move over to the Middle East, and of course we have Iraq and we have Syria. I had skipped continents and I had almost forgotten Libya. We could keep on moving to the east and start talking about the Rohingyas in Bangladesh and in Myanmar and Burma. A lot of displacement through conflict still in the southern Philippines, and we haven't even gotten to Venezuela yet. Unfortunately, a huge opportunity to practice our trade. We just have such an obligation to do it well. You know, for 2018, as Brendan had mentioned in his introduction, we went over 70 million people who were displaced. That's double the figure from 20 years ago. And I think it's 61% or so, they are based in urban areas, which is another shift. 2/3 of all of them are displaced for more than 5 years. So we can really unpack that word temporary. We design for temporary, we want temporary, but 1 in 5 is more than 20 years. So is it really? You know, and I often talk to governments about alternatives to camps, because camps are horrific places. And this is coming from an individual representing the Global Cluster Lead on Camp Coordination and Camp Management. But they create dependency, there's significant issues of sexual violence against women. There are all sorts of negative issues on the environment and elsewhere in relation to camps. Camps are very easy to open. Camps are very, very hard to close. And with some of these intractable issues, that's a perfect time to start to hand it over to the panel to listen to some of their experiences, because they're very comprehensive, and try to get some more learning from them. The first person who's going to speak is directly to the left of me, Raul Pantaleo. He's an architect and co-founder of the studio TAS Associati. Tom Associati, apologies. An Italian architect and co-founder of that studio. The practice specializing in impact design, and some of the current and completed projects include the Salam Center for Cardiac Surgery for the Emergency NGO in Sudan, 2013 winner of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, and those who know the Aga Khan know that that's a very competitive award. Congratulations. The Children's Surgery Center for Emergency NGOs in Uganda with Renzo Piani. Healthcare buildings for the emergency NGOs in Darfur, Central African Republic, Sierra Leone, Rwanda, Afghanistan. The list actually continues, but I'm going to start talking so that you can, so that everyone can learn from your experiences. The floor is yours, Raul.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. So I would like to talk about human reconstruction from a very peculiar point of view. Aesthetic and symbolic point of view. Because normally in emergency, and obviously the majority of resources, financial and human, we were talking before about resources, are invested to fulfill immediate needs, food, shelter, water, and sanitation and health. But quite rarely we can find resources invested for symbolic and aesthetic needs that, in our vision, are essential in the process of reconstruction. I would like to share with you our approach to fulfill needs outside the practical needs that, of course, are the most important and essential, and how to use design tools within human reconstruction when faced with restrictive environments, limited resources, space, and so on. We try to make a sort of toolbox, a humanistic manual to design. We put it in this book that actually is here, is in English. Concrete example that comes from our experience. In our experience, symbolic and aesthetic needs in human reconstruction are strongly linked with something that's called beauty. That, of course, is something that normally nobody talk about, humanitarian action. When we talk of beauty, we are inspired by the Greek classic concept of beauty, where word kalon includes strongly the link between good and beauty. So beauty is not something separate from the good action. And in fact, it's nothing new. If we go back to the past, in 1445, Filippo Brunelleschi, the architect of the cupola in Florence, designed Ospedale degli Innocenti, the Hospital of the Innocent. So the most important architect of his time, and maybe one of the most important architects of the history, designed one of the most important masterpiece of Italian Renaissance, dedicated to poor and abandoned infants. So that was a humanitarian project. So I think we have to learn from history, because somehow in almost 20 years of experience in all this different country, the NGO I'm working is mainly working in war-torn area, so I experience my work in this extreme condition. And quite really, the impact of the building, of course, we are working in a health facility, so we are trying to build health facilities. Nobody cares about the fact that these people are suffering, but they are suffering not only physically, but also psychologically. So with you, I would like to share today 3 simple tools that we prove on the ground. Tool number 1, use of colors. Yes, okay. In limited resources, colors, it's an extraordinary tool because it doesn't cost anything. It breaks monotony, and here you see the refugee camp here in Kanakin. It gives hope and happiness because color has a deep impact in our subconscious. It would be too long to develop this idea, but it's quite clear. And here is an example. This is the prototype clinic we designed in Iraq, in Arbat refugee camp, Quarato, and then it became a standard, where we proved that with the same budget, with the same module, prefabricated module, it was possible to design a place and not just a shelter. Second tool, use of nature. Healing gardens are very important in healing processes. This is quite obvious, so obvious and never used, and have a tremendous symbolic impact. Slide number 2. Because it represents life, it's deeply rooted in our psychology. It represents care, because to have green means to have care. It's a good activator of social life. In Apalabra, in Senegal, it's a place where people are gathering. So if you have a tree, for sure you will see people meeting around the tree. It is also important for climate mitigation. Finally, it's very cheap. Here is an example of the pediatric clinic we designed in Port Sudan. It's in a place where the government, the local government, moved all the refugees that were displaced all over the city. And we start the design of the clinic, starting to try to the way to have a garden. Of course, this is also implicated technological work about treatment water. Tool number 3, next. Use of physiognomic. This is very peculiar in our work. We developed this experience through 20 years of research, and actually there's another book. Unfortunately, it's only Italian. In our experience, it's very important to design buildings that create a dialogue with people. The main issue is how to create a common language in culture with different languages, tradition, and religion. Physiognomic can be a great tool that gives to people a clue to read and understand a building and a space. Because, again, here is quite obvious, a face, it's the most recognizable element in our common life. The face of the mother is the first thing that an infant sees all over the world. It can be in Afghanistan, in Italy, in US. So it's something that creates immediate relation to the building. Human or animal clue are very easy to understand to anybody, and it doesn't cost anything, again. And here is another example, a pediatric clinic in Darfur, in Nyala, that has a long story. Now we are trying to open it again, where we try to link the building to a very important local symbol, that's the Sphinx. And actually, there is, again, also a connection with the technological part, because the tower is the wind tower for the air treatment of the clinic. So, concluding, Prince Miskin, in The Idiot of Dostoevsky, was saying that beauty will save the world. We don't know if beauty will save the world, but for sure it makes it much, much better, and I hope we prove it with this small example. Thank you very much.
We will have opportunities for questions once all of the different panelists have been able to speak. That is, questions from the audience. But I have to take the opportunity to ask you something as a follow-up, Roa. You're talking about beauty, the use of colors, such important things in our everyday life. We take them for granted, and we often don't think about them in an environment or in an emergency context, but yet it can be done. There it is. There's the photo. It speaks for itself. Not in a forum like this, or not in Brussels, or not in DC, but on the ground, how do you get that buy-in? How do you engage with, well, who do you engage with? How do you get the buy-in? How do you make them also help to separate the urgent from the important?
Well, I think that it's just a matter of being part of the process. I mean, what is important is that somehow design is something that is separate from the process. And my experience has been that we have been one of the small element of the process. So it was easy talking with the people that are developing the project, to talk with them, just saying, hey guys, if we put the windows in a proper way, maybe the design, it doesn't make any difference in terms of cost, because at the end we are always talking of money, and good design doesn't cost more money. So we managed to realize this project because we are embedded in the process in design. And in my experience, it's very interesting that design is never embedded in the process. In the refugee camps where I work in Iraq, it was amazing that, for instance, there were Syrian refugees, and it would have been so easy to make a larger central road where they could put the market, and it wouldn't cost anything. But I was talking with the manager of the camp, and said, well, you know, we got the plan and we did it like that. So I think that what is crucial, and in my points, I always put the issue of money, because good design doesn't cost money. I mean, choosing a good color, it doesn't make a big difference. To plant a tree, it doesn't make a difference, but it makes a difference for the people that are using that space. In the clinic in Iraq, we planted a tree. It was the only tree in the camp. And the local nurse, that she was coming from Syria, she said, I'm going to pay the tree with my salary, because this is the symbol of a new life. So I think that's what I want to share with you, is that it is possible to do. It is possible to do, and design makes the difference, because we are trained to use the tools to have good design. So this is the challenge, and also it's an invitation to the people that are decision maker to choose the good design to be embedded in the process, because in a refugee camp it's possible to give quality and not to have a gray camp. I mean, all the camps I saw, were horrible camps. I mean, all gray. And of course, I'm not saying that a color camp would make the difference, but it's a matter of care, because people understand that it's a nice place to stay because it's good for us and it's good for them.
Acting as someone who has put together gray camps before, all I can say is you're correct.
Sorry.
There are more questions, and I'm sure from the audience, but first, moving down the panel to Jan-Marit Slok, an architect, a writer, urban activist about social fractures and social structures. Arriving in London from Barcelona more than a decade ago, Jan co-founded Hilo with architect Sonia Nunez Henriquez. Curious about the neglected edges of space, communities, and society, they focus on healing strategies and ephemeral aspects of migration, space, and sound. Co-author of Spatial Murmuring, Migration of Spaces and Ideas, works and papers on the architecture of biennial Venice, Home Not Shelter Refugee Initiative, which I hope we have an opportunity to talk about, insecurities, tracing displacement and shelter, and relationships with architectural practices throughout the world. Really interested to hear your thoughts, Jan.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you hear me. So I brought something, and I start a bit differently today. So I brought my mask. So I put it all on. So I see you there. Okay, why I'm doing that is following. I take it off now because I am scared of uniformity and in a way as well of anonymity. And sometimes you get the feel that camps look very uniform, at least in the initial crisis response. And a bit more, I will expand on that a bit later. At the beginning of this week, and it was mentioned that number already now several times, Filippo Grandi presented the latest refugee trend report in Berlin. And yes, we are at 70 million people at the moment, I think, or 70.8 million people being displaced or fleeing. And it's important for the statistics, of course, to get that number right, because also, as we heard, for funding purposes and for the media attention. But you know, the number scares me, and we do know big numbers can be quite dangerous because we have to be careful, because big numbers, again, create masses of people, and they become, they're hidden behind mask of the refugees, us and them. And you know, populist movements around the world, particularly also now in UK or in Europe, they are fed by this motion or this sense of fear, of threat, sense of losing control. But I would like to give a more positive notion to, and that is important for all of us because we work on that, is a positive notion on migration. In a way, I mean, we have two legs. It's written in our DNA. I mean, we walk, we migrate. And we are all here because we started migrating hundreds of thousands of years ago. If not, we would be still sitting in that very first cramped cave, right? Just imagine that. And, you know, we have Refugee Week as well in UK this week. And in my son's school, they talked about certain issues. I asked him, so what would the world look like without migration? And he's quite young, of course, but he simply said, oh, that would be terribly boring. So the idea was that, of course, we started walking and we encountered challenges, failures, successes, and others. And then we passed on the word, what we learned to our next generations through storytelling. And this is quite important as well later on, the storytelling, the sound, the word. So what happened then was, of course, that migrants, in fact, were our mentors. They were our teachers. They also, they were kind of decision makers and risk takers, something which is highly regarded nowadays in the industry and business. So I think we can learn a lot from them. And I would like to say that when I studied, of course, the edges and boundaries, and while we migrated, it was always a relatively easy task. But the moment borders emerged around territories, or around assets, or around groups of people, all of a sudden, people were being pushed out or not let in. So that became very dangerous, the migration. And unfortunately, it fills me with sadness that nowadays we still can see walls emerging. Because myself, I grew up in the Cold War Germany, and there was this sense of freedom of hope when 1989 all the walls came down in Germany, and the European project became quite successful back then. You could travel from A to B, from Portugal to Poland without a passport. And there was this sense of togetherness. Now, I put this photo up, and of course, you could argue it's, again, a kind of a dilemma we have in the media. This photo could mean a little kid being on a boat in the Mediterranean Sea and looking for a safer life. So quite a drama attached to it, or as simple as that. This is my daughter sitting on a little boat on a sunny day out and just holding a hand over the water. But nevertheless, I wanted to quote another Italian. I mean, Italians are very popular nowadays. Leonardo da Vinci, who passed away 500 years ago, said back then, and this is quite spectacular, in rivers, the water that you touch is the last of what has passed, and the water you touch is the first that will come. It's a brilliant quote about temporality and about what we're encountering in the refugee camps, because it's a snapshot, actually, of a moment in time, and we must not forget the history where they come from and the future where they go to. And sometimes we can learn also from music, because music of the centuries connect the communities, though everyone speaks a different language, but everyone understands music. So there is this interesting, extraordinary genre of music called the fugue. Bach and Handel, they mastered it. And it was, as such, it can be described, I mean, nowadays even modern pop music uses these kind of elements of the fugue. There's a leading melody and other melodies or tunes following it up or chasing it relentlessly. And it all ends up in the end in absolute balance or harmony. So this reminds me of the refugee work is all communities, international communities, they speak different languages, they have different interests. We see the refugees coming from different backgrounds, different families, poor, old, I mean, just different societies as well. They're all together, and we want to make it happen that it all becomes harmony, as architects, as planners, as ground workers, as NGOs as well. The question is, how do we do that? As an architect, you usually have a site, a brief, an area, a budget, you know the users, you know the program. Now here, that's very difficult because we don't know. The only certainty is it will happen again next week, tomorrow, in 2 or 3 weeks. I don't know. The ephemeral, what Brian mentioned earlier, is therefore of interest because the ephemeral gives an opportunity, a relentless opportunity to get involved for everyone, us, the stakeholders, but also the refugees to create their own environment. And it is important that when we look at these photos, and I have to say, this is, I mean, there's another photo there as well, of course, it's very modular, the refugee camps as we know them at the beginning, because of course, nobody's questioning it. This is an initial crisis response, and we need to provide affordable response for, and to provide safety, water, access to doctors and such. But then soon, when that becomes permanent, right, then we need to start thinking how these could become home. Home is very important. So from shelter to home is quite an important topic. I think we need to look at it. Because if you look at the gridded structures, it could be as easy as rotating one, or as Raoul said, adding a color to some of the shelters or tents. So that could create togetherness. You know, it's like city quarters. You could say, I live there, this is my family, this is my clan, this is here and that. So you start creating a little bit of belonging. But I think it's much, much more deeper because of the wounds, they're there and want to be healed. So maybe you put the next slide on, if you don't mind. This is, you saw earlier as well on the introduction, this is one of the papers, research and competitions we did for Ceuta. Ceuta, I don't know if you're aware, but it's a northern African country in Morocco where a lot of migrants come because they're in the sense of hope and departing the harbor towards Europe, you know, the golden Europe. And the influx of migrants is so huge, and desperation as well, and such a drama as well happening there. So we said, why not moving away for once in this kind of, let's say, drawing board study as such, from the gridded structure, what would it mean? So this is more a framework, but wants to open the minds as well. So how can we create a flux of spaces, spaces with concentration, of openness, of narrowness? How can people express themselves? So very expressive, and in a way also symbolizes the way and the journey of migrants, because they come from different countries, different societies. They spend some time together for a few years, a few months, we don't know, and then they depart, and they will never, most probably never see each other again. So therefore, the streets, in a way, with different as well intensity, show this kind of movement we think is important. It's a kind of architectural storytelling, and everyone is invited to read it on a Medium as well. There's more information about it, because thankfully in 2 years ago in the MoMA exhibition in security, Sean Anderson decided to take it on board as well, this project. So what we also have in our vocabulary for work we are doing, of course, is participation. Participation is a big word nowadays, also part of the emergency handbook, of course, and rightly so. So what we did on a communal level, particularly in Germany as well, my hometown in Cologne, slightly different, but it relates. There was a city square which was neglected for 20, 30 years. It was filled with fear, and people didn't like it. They didn't want to go there. It became emptiness. It was a synonym of the broken society, because there was crime, drug addicts came there, and all of a sudden, with the influx of migrants in Germany, the migrants were blamed for everything. So what we did, we engaged with stakeholders, published articles, brought them together, and together with the city officials as well, we managed to turn it around last year. So the fountain is there, is loved again. Kids were actually painting the staircases. We brought the light in, and other measures will include, other parties are involved, of course, and other architects as well. So the other one I wanted to mention is the Home Not Shelter initiative in Munich. It was shortly initiated after the borders were opened by Angela Merkel, as you know. It was a few years back, and around 1 million migrants came over the border through Austria into Germany. And we needed to, in general, as citizens or as designers in Germany, we were asked, so where do we house them? What is happening? Because when they came, they were all in sports halls, all together as well, and without thinking where they came from, which grouping of women and men together. There was a lot of harassment happening as well. And the idea here was, okay, let's have a design ideas competition workshop as well. What can we do? Now, I will later on hopefully have the chance to talk about it a bit more. But apart from that, we also look at edges. So a wall is an edge. But also, I wanted to highlight here our work which we did this was more an art installation in an old abandoned mental clinic in a hospital in the Dutch border, where we wanted to let literally the light into the spaces which were filled of sadness, as well as with a very, let's say, not very pleasant history from the Nazi Germany, which was very, very scaring and dramatic as well. So our idea was to actually bring through interventions of installation the light into the room, and almost make the visitor trying to catch that light. I have some books here, you can later on have a look at that. But more importantly, because I'm in New York, and you have a wonderful High Line here. Everyone loves, worldwide, globally celebrated the High Line. In the first competition, it's a long time ago, not so very successfully, Sonia and I participated. And what we did there back then is, because for us it's important to listen to the space, what are the problems. The problems was never really, of course, the access was a problem. But you know, we felt there is the space under the High Line. And what is happening with this space? This space is filled with anxiety, with darkness, and with loneliness. So we started thinking of perforating the High Line, of course with a park and public space above, but it felt that we wanted to shed light into the spaces underneath and the edges of society, and the edges of space of a city, and therefore give this space basically back to New York as well. We could create revenue then with new cafes or properties, which then pay for the park above. This was just an example of how architecture actually can have really social impact, or could have social impact. So I think listening to the symptoms of a space, of people as well, but of spaces, is very important. They could have anxiety, as I said, and lonely, rejection, and stress. You know, building materials, construction materials, as we all know as well from building shelters and the architects from the design, they can break under stress, heat or load, But you know, so people can also do break, or they do break under stress. So for us, all of us here, it is actually paramount to reduce the stress through a program, through creating a space, through architecture as well, through creating an urban design which anchors society or communities as well. So I just wanted to say, we are almost finishing, I'm closing down, because the wounds, they want to be healed. Because I think before the wounds, and everyone is quite under stress, before the wounds become bitterness and anger and hatred, and then being carried into the future countries or back into the home countries, I think it's up to us as well to inject optimism and a belief in a better future, and get everyone involved working on that one. And I would recommend for the afternoon session as well to try to avoid the anonymity and to break down the mask which people are hiding behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne-Maurice. Then our third member of the panel is Johan Carlson, an industrial designer and managing director of Better Shelters. Spent the last 12 years leading a cooperative project together with UNHCR and the IKEA Foundation to develop flat-packed emergency shelters for protracted crises. In 2013, as part of the team, installed the first prototypes in Khabarovsk, Kurdistan region of Iraq. 6 years later, some 40,000 of these shelters have been provided globally. Just came back from Khabarovsk, where he visited the families who lived in the units since, and you're going to share some of the lessons along the way. So the floor is yours, Johan.
Thank you. So, hi everyone, good to be here. Thanks everyone, thanks Poland for hosting this. I'm very glad to be back in New York. I come from a product design background, which started in New York. I came to New York in the year 2000 to study engineering. All of my friends were studying art and design, and I took path and I changed my studies, you know, and I took on courses at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn instead. And my parents, they were not overwhelmed, positive to that change of path, but to me it was important. So I think that was it. And before coming into the humanitarian world, I was doing fabrics, pendant lamps, and other, you know, interior design objects. Now, by coincidence, I got, you know, someone asking me at the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency to help support redesigning a tent that was going to be used in Pakistan. And that's how I entered the humanitarian space. And now 11 years later, you know, still here I am. So this was something that's by coincidence. Coming from a product background, I of course had a very much of a product perspective onto shelter. And I've learned a lot along the way. And I think, just to think back, when we started this project with UNHCR and the IKEA Foundation, it was 10 years ago. And if those of you who don't know about the shelter, I think we are a very small company, we're 17 people. But if you may know IKEA or IKEA shelters, you know, because that's how most people know about us. Our project, we started back in 2010. And already then, this, you know, the continuum of, you know, linking humanitarian to development aid was very strong. And the approach was already then, I would say, since long, really to go with local solutions. And that was for very good reasons. We had, you know, socially, all families are different. Culturally, we are different. We eat, we sleep, we spend time differently. We are from, you know, we have different environments, and we have, you know, and usually locally we know how to deal with the environment we are in. So these were sort of known to us where we started. And we also said that economically, you know, it's hard to defend that we are investing in global solutions like tents or like the shelters that we are supplying right now. Because in 80% of the cases, the communities that are hosting refugees are developing countries. So by investing in tents or prefab shelters from elsewhere, we are actually shipping money out from where they would be better needed. So I think then it's easy to ask ourselves the question, so why on earth did we go for a prefabricated solution in this project? And I think that to say that the local approach, first of all, it is still the main approach. You can go to humanitarian, you know, to UNHCR handbook, you know, it's very easy. We are doing some 20,000 shelters a year, and we are addressing situations that are niche where local situations do not work for various reasons. It's not an intent to replace local solutions. On the opposite, we encourage them whenever possible. But typically, we are working in situations where you have local supply chains that cannot deal with a high influx. So I think that was the case, for example, we have been dealing with the Iraqi response, the Burundi response, and even the Venezuelan response. You have a lot of people coming in, and if you go locally, you get price shocks on the local markets. You may have deforestation, you don't have enough local materials. So these are the situations that we are designed for. And when we started, it was actually about, we were trying to link these together. We were saying that let's have a standalone frame that we can use, and you can wrap it. Actually, was we designed our shelter around the IFRC plastic sheeting back at the time because the measurements fitted better. And they can upgrade it locally, or you can import some cladding material or wall elements that are prefabricated where you cannot go with the local solutions. That was what we thought. But then we saw more and more, particularly from our colleagues in HER, that that this is complicated in many of our situations where we are working with protected prices and large prices. I mean, typical projects we're doing 1,500 shelters or so. And we're typically also complementing local approaches. And so we said, this is difficult for us because we may get, the bamboo in, but the nails and the hammer, they are stuck in customs. So this was sort of the type of situations that we wanted to address. We started development in 2000. It took us some 3 years to do testing of the shelters before we could do the first field tests. That was in 2013 in Kabagos in Iraq. This was in the emergency. I think this is quite a typical solution where we are believing that we make sense. Iraq is the #1 country that we have been shipping units to. I think we have more than 10,000 units in Iraq only. We set up these units in from 2013 in the Iraqi response. This was in the camp of Kabagos. We had 10,000 people basically coming overnight. And he really discussed the need for shelter because there was nothing, there was not a tree in sight. And there was a beating heat of 40 degrees and more in the days. So that's where we came in. It was an emergency setting. And the typical response was pitching tents. So we can discuss about site planning and all that, but this was about, there was a pre-stockpile of tents available. And I think very quickly, HER and their partners, they managed to get the tents up. Within 2 months later, that's when we came in. There was a master plan in place actually for the camp. So there was already, the link, the planning had started. And we set up our shelters here, and we targeted vulnerable families because our shelters were a bit larger, and they had a door that you could lock and a lamp that you could turn on. So they were sort of just a little bit nicer, than tents, and it lasted longer. So that's where we started. And then I think what we have learned along the way is that from a product perspective, we always tend to think as the product as the end game. We try to see that, we have tested this according to all these engineering standards, we've done this and that, so the product is in mint condition with engineering. I think our lessons learned is that from a humanitarian perspective, that's just a starting point. Changes to our structures, they start immediately at day one. I think that was also that we know because HER colleagues informed us about this. So when designing global solutions, we have to put in as many options to adapt the design locally as you can possible. So, because there is no one solution where how many windows you will want to have, or where you want the window, or where you want the door position. So we had a design that can elaborate, that's modular, that you can change these things. And that happened. And people changed a lot more than we intended them to. There was, the plastic sheets that we had for floorings, they were sold in the market, I think, within the first 3 months, to get some income. And here, in this camp, people get work. They casted concrete floor. They used our structure to upgrade it with, CGI sheet roofings, etc. So this was part of it was really a part of the process. And now, 6 years later, when we came back to Kabagos, Kabagos is one of these camps which I think has been very successful. It's actually looking more and more like a village right now. The fences around it is being, it's not there anymore, and most people are working. In the camps, they have a job, so they have an income. But they're still using these shelters, as living rooms, as garden sheds, or whatever. But they have a durable solution. I think what we also have learned is that how much we want as designers to provide good solutions. In the end, this is very much a political issue. I think we're having some 14,000 tents still in the region. Tent camps that has been there since we started in 2013, most of them. And we have 14,000 of these tents that are still to be replaced. And there is no other plan, then, to when we get funding in, we replace them with tents or maybe with some shelters as we are doing. It's not because we're not wanting to do durable solutions, it's because there's no incentive to do durable solutions. So I think that this is working with this, and I think it's a final note for us that working with design, from our perspective, we want to work with the beneficiaries as much as possible to see what do they prefer. But as often as I'm asked to present our solution to local authorities and governments and NGOs, as often as I'm asked about the properties of how safe it is to live inside it and what it can do and how it resists the weather, as often I'm said, okay, but how do you put it back to the box? That does never happen, I would say. Very, very seldom it happens. These are the prototypes that we did in 2013, still here, 6 years later. But, as because all the land, typical land right issues, you don't want the camps to be there forever. This is an important sort of design function. And we may think it's cynical, but I think it's it is universal, and I don't think it's cynical to the host populations. Once I returned from a project we were doing in Lebanon, and we had to stop the setup because we really had, the neighbors had something to say about building a camp where we were setting it up, basically, so they were not positive. I came back to where I live in Stockholm, in this townhouse in the suburb of Stockholm, and we had immigrants coming to Stockholm, and they just made a camp in the forest behind where we live. And that camp was actually worse condition than many of the camps that I've been, in developing countries. And my neighbors, they were like, yeah, we don't mind migrants, we really want them, but do we have to settle just here? Why just here? Because our kids are playing here, it's not safe. And I think that is sort of one of these key challenges when working with design in this sector that we always have to adapt to. Because of course we would like to go durable. I would wish that we would not need solutions like ours. I would want that we could create society better. I think as designers, we have to balance this and work within these tight boundaries that we have. So that was quickly from me. Yeah, and I think that, final note on the picture back. This is actually from Iraq. This is about different cultures and communities. When we are getting married, when people go on a honeymoon, people in these camps didn't have it, but they had one honeymoon shelter. And this is what we see. So when you get wedding, when you're married, then you had a few nights, or something, a few weeks. It depends who married next, how much time you have. So you can stay together. So I think that this is also an unforeseen, use. Which I think, so basically our lessons learned is that yes, global will be needed, but we have designers to work to make them as much locally integrated and locally adapted as possible. So that was it. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Johan. Johan, I've got a follow-up question for you. Because I know as you've introduced the technology into the humanitarian community, there's been a lot of skepticism, right? And even as recent as this morning during your keynote, Richard, representing the Federation of the Red Cross, it's about process, not product. It's about if the issues with deficient local supply chains, and let's try to fix those local supply chains, and the practicality, how do you deal with the spare parts, the cost per beneficiary versus what others may get. How, and this is an unfair question because I'll ask you to try to respond in just like 2 minutes, but how do you respond to that? How do you take that in, and just what are your feelings overall?
No. I mean, we're very well aware of that, of course, and what we are saying that when we can fix it, when we have the option to do it, let's do it. As I said, UNHCR, they're doing 300,000 shelters a year, approximately, they're setting up. 300,000. 15,000 or so are shelters like this kind. So it's one shelter in a palette of options. So it's nothing that's aimed to replace other ones. I think Iraq is a good example, because I think many of us, including HR, IOM, I know, we are, having tented camps still and prefab, camps. So there are needs for that. But if you can fix it locally, then I think you should, go ahead and do it, because I would encourage it. So I think that would be my short. And I think that is also, and I think also it's a difference between response, very different dynamics after conflict and after natural disasters. Mm-hmm. It's someone who really brought me the shelters of process was Graham Saunders at IFRC, and he had a lot to say about how our project was heading, because we were working together in the beginning, you know, when we were sort of more of a transitional approach. And we noticed that, and what he said to me was, you know, a reality check, you know, we can spend, I think it was like $10 per person in shelter. You know, your shelter is $1,000, it's not relevant for us. And I think that we have to also see that no situation are the same, and also organizational needs are different between different organizations, and basically very different dynamics after natural disasters than in conflict and protracted crisis.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for that thoughtful response. We always have these ideas about what we're going to do, and we've had such great examples, and it always comes down to how are you going to finance them, and how are you going to catalyze. And I'm so glad. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. But I'm just so glad to introduce Lauren Kavanaugh-Ulka, the team leader of Open Innovation Competitions, the U.S. Global Development Lab at USAID. Lauren leads USAID's Open Innovation Competition portfolio, which aims to uncover, test, and scale new development and humanitarian solutions. In this role, Lauren works with teams around the world to develop and successfully implement open innovation competitions that are open to solutions from anywhere in the world and reflect the needs and priorities of communities. So please, the floor is yours, Lauren. Thank you.
So it's really hard to follow these guys because they're the innovators and the ones I admire deeply. And it's also, you know, I'm a bureaucrat. I'm from Washington, D.C., and big secret, I have not been in a refugee camp ever. I actually represent the other side of the house, but I work very closely with our humanitarian assistance team to help build a program that I want to tell you a little bit about, where we're trying to create opportunities for financing innovation and innovative ideas that come from the local communities that we're working with or are inspired by the local communities we're working with. So let me give you a little bit of context about the program I'm going to tell you about. So over 200 million people require humanitarian assistance today. Millions of people, of the most vulnerable people, are in conflict zones, which are very difficult for us to reach, and often aid can't get to them easily. So if you're thinking about Yemen or Syria or DRC, you're thinking about communities where it's just impossible to reach some people and provide better services and support for those who are displaced. At USAID, nearly 90% of our humanitarian assistance dollars support complex emergency situations. But as the length and frequency and scope of complex emergency situations continues to increase, it's progressively getting more and more difficult for us to respond to all those challenges around the world with the resources we currently have and with the solutions we've been using that we've tested in the past. So we're trying to think about what are new ways, new strategies for us to reach those communities and those affected by these complex emergency situations with new approaches and new ideas. One other layer that I want to add to this situation, or to this really complex situation, is that less than 1% of all humanitarian funding is invested in innovation. So that means there's very little priority for this. I think that's changing, but up to this date, it's not a top priority. We're just trying to get aid out the door and to the people who need it most. But at USAID, we're really trying to transform the way we deliver development assistance and humanitarian assistance. I work in the U.S. Global Development Lab, which is essentially the innovation incubation center for the agency, where we're trying to test out new program design opportunities. We're working with user-centered design principles. We're working with adaptive management programming. We're working with challenges open innovation, which is opening up the world, open up problems to the world and inviting the world to help propose solutions. We fund those solutions. We help identify where we can use them in our own work, and we help ensure that other donors are aware that these solutions exist so they can uptake it as well. So in the lab, we're really trying to shift the culture of the agency, and in the humanitarian assistance space in particular, they're very open to this and looking at new ways that they could be doing business to bring in new solvers, new actors, new potential partners, and bring in these new solutions so ultimately they're becoming more effective and efficient with their assistance. In the open innovation space in particular, one thing that we think a lot about is how to make USAID more permeable to actors who are traditionally not eligible for our awards. Oftentimes, I'm sure you know this, we put out a request for proposal and pretty much 20 to 30 implementing firms around the world are competitive to actually get the money from those proposals. We're trying to change that completely, make it easier, faster, for anybody to access our procurement structures. So open innovation competitions, that's like an easy way. We're trying to lower the bar significantly to allow for better shelter to get into USAID and start working with us on some of our programs. Maybe you already are. Excuse me if I didn't know that. But how else can we bring in other solvers who have fantastic ideas? We want to figure out how to broaden our network, bring in these fabulous ideas, and ensure that we're being most effective. So what we did in 2018 was working with the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. We recognized that for the complex emergency space and trying to get aid into these very difficult environments, we really need to open this call up to the world and invite others to bring their ideas to the table. So we launched Creating Hope in Conflict, which is a grand challenge for humanitarian assistance. It's a $32.5 million challenge, which we're partnering with the UK Department for International Development. We're working with the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it's implemented by Grand Challenges Canada, which is supported by Global Affairs Canada. So it brings together all of these very important donor partners who all agree that this is an issue that we cannot solve on our own. We need to come together. We need to invite the world to help share ideas for us to better support people in these complex emergency situations. But also we want to find how can we work with communities to develop those solutions as well. So this fund, we launched it last year with our first call for innovations. The first call was focused on finding and accelerating solutions that enable life-saving or life-improving assistance to reach the most vulnerable and hardest to reach people in conflict-generated humanitarian crises in 4 sectors. So safe water and sanitation, energy, life-saving information, health supplies and services. And you'll notice these are actually massive buckets. So we do have some key requirements around what we're specifically looking for in each of these buckets. But those are essentially, we're opening up the door. We are looking for processes, approaches, and technologies. We're not just focused on gadgets. We really do think that process innovation is a critical part of this puzzle. So we're inviting solvers to come up with new ways to get, to deal with supply chain issues, or to develop products in the communities using 3D printers, or thinking about how telemedicine can help support medical assistance. So we're looking at lots of different solutions that can help us address the problems that we're facing around the world. For our first call for innovations, we had an unprecedented response. We were amazed that we got over 600 applications in for the first call. That's a fantastic response because we didn't think anybody was going to have solutions, frankly. This was such an experiment from our perspective. We were like, if we get 100, if we get 200, we'll be really happy. But we were overwhelmed with the response. These applications came from 86 countries around the world. They dealt with a wide variety of issues, from gender-based violence applications, that are helping women become more secure in a camp situation, from smart toilets, essentially, that help reduce the need for removal of waste. There's just a really exciting array of innovations that came in, and we ended up funding 22 of those innovations. I mean, the requests for funding were over $187 million. So we recognize that that's like a really small piece, and there was so much more that we could have funded, and we really wanted to. But we recognize that we want to do several rounds of this challenge because we think it's important that more people are aware of the challenge opportunity. We are hoping to bring in more donors to build the funding pot to ensure that there's more money for innovation in humanitarian space. We also want to open up the door for private sector engagement around the solutions that we fund, because we don't want to just fund solutions. We actually want to build an ecosystem around those solutions and ensure that innovators are not standing on their own, but they actually have mentors and other funders and other investors that are around them that could help bring these ideas forward and make them sustainable for the future. So the reason I'm here today is because we actually just recently opened up that second call on May 21st. It's open until July 16th. So I would encourage you all to go to the website and check out what the application details are. I'm going to be here today, so if you have any questions or if you have ideas that you'd like to bounce off of me, I'd love to talk to you about what might be competitive for the competition program. But you know, this is really just the first step, I think, in the humanitarian space. We're currently looking at other problems that we could potentially be addressing with open innovation, but it all needs to be really rooted in the needs of the community and working with the community to identify their problems and build the appropriate solutions.
Thank you very much for that, Lauren. And I saw a lot of note-taking when you were given those dates. So I think you're going to have some. I think you're going to have some follow-up from the audience. So we're just about to open it up to the audience. But just a question for you, Lauren. We're talking about innovation and taking new approaches with design, while getting assistance to the most vulnerable during the most vulnerable moment of their lives. And I'm just, how do you find that balance? What kind of discussion internally do you have about that balance between innovation and some tried and tested practices that bring size, scale, and speed that ain't pretty, but they've proven fairly effective? Could you just talk a minute or two about that, please?
Well, first I should note that even on our advisory council, we work with affected communities. We make all of our decisions with affected community members as part of the investment committee. So all of this is actually vetted by affected community members, which I think is really important to note. Second, we invest in tiers. So we're investing in everything from really good ideas at the pilot stage, so very early stage, to at a $250,000 level, and then we invest in things that are ready to transition to scale at the $1 million level. We understand that things at the $250,000 level are going to be really, sometimes they might be really amazing, out there ideas, and we want to test them out. You know, they're going to be pretty awesome. Those at the $1 million level might look more familiar, and they might be things that you've heard about before, but they're things that have been tested out, they've been proven, they might have been proven in another market, and we're trying to replicate it or scale parts of that, that model. So I think, you know, there's the different tiers that allow us to have flexibility in investing in things that are really kind of out of the box at the earlier stage, and those things that are probably, you know, more tried, true, tested, you know, ready to scale at the later stage. So kind of tier it that way. And then also just recognizing that innovation can be incremental, and that's okay, and it's acceptable. And sometimes just testing out an idea in a new market or a new place that's innovative. One of the things that we funded was actually a maggot therapy solution, and that's such an old idea, but in the context that we were funding it in, it was brand new. We actually had a lot of questions. Is the community going to accept this option? Are they going to be willing to have maggots on open wounds? I mean, for us, it sounds kind of horrifying, but actually, you know, through our process of evaluation and working with the community, we understood that it was, people found like, oh, that's pretty compelling, and in that community, it was a new idea that they had never seen before. So you can kind of see there's a lot of opportunity for being very creative with solutions that just might be new to a new context.
That's great. Thank you. And I want to thank all of you as panelists for your own self-moderation with the time, because I am pleased to say that we wanted to have a half an hour for questions and answers and really open it up to everyone, and we've got a good 26 minutes, so I think we can take that. That's really quite good. And then one request that I had just for the panelists for the live cast, just if you could just get a little bit closer to the mic when you're speaking to make sure that it's getting picked up for those who are listening elsewhere. So now it's open for questions, thoughts from the audience. Please, we have maybe if it's okay, we'll start with two at a time, because I saw you had your hand raised as well. But please.
Okay, my name's Tony Land. I've had about 45 years experience in humanitarian work, and I believe the time has come for us to up our ambitions in terms of shelter. And earlier this year I had the opportunity to speak to the global shelter cluster leads, and I presented them with the challenge of design for a decade of dignified living. And I think that is where we need to be aiming to go in the future. And if we think about a family, there is a simple specification for a family to meet that requirement, because a tent or a one-room shelter doesn't do it. A family needs a cooking space, a sanitation space, a living space, and 2 or 3 private sleeping spaces. And that specification was presented by a government 70 years ago and resulted in a complete change of the housing structure of that country. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony.
Hello, I'm Lily from the DEP Innovation Labs. Thank you, everyone. I had a question for Lauren about the actual adoption of innovations into the humanitarian sector. It's a really hard sector to break into, so I was curious what USAID is doing to work on that side.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, and it's a problem that we're really trying to solve. Actually, I don't know if this is it on? Okay. What we're trying to do right now is do a lot of socialization at every stage of when we get the applications in and when we're reviewing it. We're inviting lots of people across the agency, as well as outside actors. So we invite experts from across the humanitarian space to weigh in and identify what applications are really feasible, what's really innovative, what do they feel is really going to kind of push the needle. So we're trying to, at that stage, start to introduce these ideas. And then once we get to award, we do a lot of introduction. We do a lot of road shows, inviting the innovators in so that they could share their stories directly with our colleagues, so that they're aware of that. And then we do a lot of impact analysis and collect and monitoring and evaluation of all their programs, share the insights from all of those programs, with the goal of ultimately, by helping them socialize those ideas, become more aware of them. Ultimately, we're helping them start see where these innovations can fit in their portfolios and their programs. We're also working on the procurement side to figure out how do we lessen the burden so that we don't have to take another procurement action, so that it makes it easier for us to adopt those innovations. Meaning, they've already satisfied competition by applying to the challenge and getting in through that network. Do we have to make them compete again for funding? We're looking at different ways to reduce that burden for innovators ultimately.
That's excellent. And then just before we move it to other questions, any of the panelists that wanted to respond to Tony about a time to be ambitious and designing for a decade. What are your thoughts on what does that look like? And certainly one challenge that we'll have to do is the financing of it. Please, Ro.
Yeah, of course, I agree with your proposal, but the point is that we have to be realistic. There is a precise will from the government to leave the refugees in a bad condition. I mean, this is very political, but for instance, in Iraq, actually Kurdistan, Iraq, I mean, there was 2 different kind of refugee camps, one for the Kurdish Syrian that were welcome, and one for the Iraqi that were not welcome. And there was a specific mandate from the local government to leave the people in a bad condition because they want them to go back. So I think that, of course, we can talk all day about good shelter, good condition and all that, but then we have to face, and of course it's not our role as designer, but I think this is relevant. In Sudan was the same. You know, I have been working in the refugee camps in Khartoum. There was, for South Sudan people, there was not a real will to keep them in a good condition. And so this is beside any decision we can make in terms of quality design, and of course of the biggest organization that are working, we have to be very realistic that all our actions are overlapped by the local community decision. So it's very, I mean, it's very, very delicate. I mean, I think that quality design work as far as there is a real will to have quality design. Because this is also, I mean, I'm talking from Italy, we have a major problem now with refugee in Italy. Right now, there is no will to welcome them. I mean, all the things that are happening are exactly on the other side, not to give quality. So the people are just going away, I hope at least.
Okay, well, thank you for your response to that. And just want to open it up to some more questions. See, we have one here, we have one there, and I saw one was there. So maybe we'll take these two and make sure that you're first in the next round.
Hi, I'm Deborah Rogers. I just graduated from Fordham with an international studies degree. My original degree was from FIT, Fashion Institute in New York, here in New York, and I worked for 2 decades in the designing clothing. Now that I have a degree in international studies and want to work in peace mediation, for example, but believe in the process and the design of any good process in addition to products, I'm finding, I would love to ask all of you, even from the bureaucratic standpoint, but from the flexibility standpoint of the 21st century in terms of getting employment. Like, so as I bring myself into the realm of saying I'm here and I can do work, and here's my background. It's perplexing to me because there's so many ways in which there are obstacles before those of us who want to work in the fields in which you're all working in. And I mean, I'll plow through it because being a Garmento, that's what we do. But I just wonder if you have any insight, you know, all of you, because you're working with new people all the time that want to support your mission. Do you have any sort of suggestions for those of us who are perhaps recent graduates or interested in completely bringing our vast background into this innovative space as a hybrid, as a multi-hyphenate, sort of non-traditional?
Thank you for that. And then there was another question, right? 2 rows up.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I just finished undergrad. Thank you so much for coming and speaking today. I had a question about kind of how you think about the political implications of beautifying and durability. And there's a few different things that I'm thinking about in that regard. One of which is host populations, maybe Palestine or Tibet, where communities might not actually want durable development, or where beautifying kind of runs up against the political need to kind of demonstrate a certain kind of suffering. And then also, kind of on the flip side, how to think about communities or countries that don't want to, that aren't as receptive to refugees, or that, you know, there's rampant nationalism, and maybe where the processes of beautification and you know, moving humanitarian work towards something that looks a little bit more like development, how those communities might kind of respond negatively to the sort of beautifying processes. So I'm just wondering, yeah, more of the like political implications of beauty and design and durability. Thank you.
Jan Maurice, yeah, would you be able to comment on that one?
I'm more than happy.
And I can throw something in on the employment in a bit if it comes.
I think we talked about beauty, and of course, and the good shelters as well. Tony, it's yeah. Sorry, I think it's important to understand that when people get invited to take care of their own environment, we can reduce the cost, we can also improve their will of empowerment. There was, I mean, here in New York, I mean, the era of Jane Jacobs and Newman and defensible spaces, it's a very, very close link as well of people living, for example, in anonymous tower blocks or environments, and they lose the will to take care of their immediate surrounding or gardens or such. And this is hunting us down as architects, well, since the time of Le Corbusier, that there's a very, very fine balance in between people get engaged, and therefore maybe we can create a toolbox for them to create their own home, own cooking area, own, let's say, living space, or their own community space. So maybe we can change the ship and say we deliver you with materials, but please get it. Not everyone wants to do that, of course, and not everyone is educated in craftsmanship or building and such, but you can start waving maybe your own doors or curtains and stuff. And I know it's already happening, but maybe it comes down then, to you that we say, well, that could create a quite huge impact. And also you mentioned it earlier, Johan, as well, that we of course, we encourage everyone getting involved. It's not us sitting here as designers say, oh, this has to be done. This is a very fancy tool, or as it was mentioned before, somebody comes up with an idea. Innovation is important as well, but it's that the people need to buy in, right? And this is not only happening in the refugee camps in Syria or in Iraq, but also in our countries where we all live, where then later on migrants might come or end up being, that they get integrated, and they get as well a happy living, I have to say, right? And I think this is very important. And just to your point, I mean, I read, of course, the emergency handbook, and it's a brilliant piece of work, and almost everything is already set in there. But when you see, for example, that maybe you're aware of that, I think the size given, because you need to do calculations. You have so many people coming to a refugee camp, and you need a certain amount of space to plan, a rule of thumb. I think it's in between 30 to 35 square meter at the moment per person, including infrastructure. So in the commercial planning business, that is exactly the figure what we plan for car parking structures in our countries. So basically, when you plan for a multiple car parking deck, it's 30 square meter per car. So we expect that to be for actually human beings and people. So I think what could be, if we could anchor that or rephrase that in a way, that would be very helpful for the whole discussion as well. Maybe we can increase the area, or we dissect that in a different way, that we create community spaces as such.
Great, thank you. And Johan, when the question about political implications of beautifying, you can almost tweak it to political implications of upgrading, and you're dealing with your shelters that are coming. You want to talk a bit about that?
I think that, I mean, now I'm speaking from the brutalistic end here, so I wouldn't say this is the most fine architecture that we are providing. It's sort of, we have designed our shelters from a very rational, from a manufacturing point of view, design. I think that about the beautification, I think that as designers going in, particularly if you're working, it's a difference if you're working with a local solution and you can go in and you can work directly with the community and the people of concern, or if you're designing a prefabricated unit, which we are doing. Because when we are doing that, then I think we have to acknowledge that we have to design it in a way that it's as open for local changes and adaptations as possible. It's as open as possible for local upgrades, that you possibly can do. Because we will not know. We know that there are no families the same. The situation, the Burundi response is so different from the Iraq response, yet we are having thousands of shelters in both responses. They're not going to look the same 3 years from now and be treated differently. So that's something that we have to acknowledge in our design. And I think also when we're looking at funding, this is what I say, we have to think about an incremental approach we have to allow our prefabricated shelters to go by the actual incremental shelter approach that is happening in camps. Because if we're looking from a funding perspective, for example, when I started working in 2010 with UNHCR, we discussed a lot about multi-year financing and how multi-year financing is going to change the way we are doing camps, because it's better than to invest $1,000 up front for a shelter that lives for 3 to 6 years than to spend, and have a 10 to 10 replacement program, or, But the reality is still today that most camps that or projects we're working on, they have a 1 to maximum 2 year perspective. There's no way you can write off the investment, of a durable solution. So even if you would have the political right, you need the political will to make a durable solution, that would be hard to manage. Rather, you're having quite some money coming in the beginning, when there's an international attention to an emergency, and then you have a little less and less and less, and then you go to the protracted crisis, Dolo, Ado, Dadaab, for example, where you're having very little funding, but you have some little coming in year by year. And we have a prefab solution. I think what we have to do, this is not about beautification, it's more about long term. We have to ensure that what we ship in the first place makes sense over the longer term. That can be maintained, repaired, and that can be upgraded locally. So I think that's sort of, so it sounds a bit boring, but it really is about, adapting the design to the actual process.
Great, thank you. And then maybe I could ask you, Raul, if you want to try to answer the question about when you're dealing with someone, they've gathered a specialized skill in design. We have this world of humanitarian response. How do you pull those two together? How do you turn that into a career? You have a lot of different examples on the ground in various countries where you've been doing that.
Well, first of all, we made a decision 25 years ago to match our social engagement. We were all activists in my office, different field in humanitarian, myself, in environmental, my partner, and so on. And we took the challenge to organize a non-profit organization as service in terms of design to these different actors. So I can talk about Italy, of course, because we have been working mainly with Italian organization. And first of all, we act as citizens, first of all. I mean, we are all activists. And so there is no separation between our work and our will in terms of citizenship. So this is something that I always recommend to my student at university. I mean, there is no separation between your profession and your day life. This at least is important for us. So there is a big need, and I think that slowly it has been proved that design can make a lot of difference. Venice Biennale of 2016 of Alejandro Aravena has been a big open to this, but there is this very important issue for us as designer. We are not designing one piece, but we are designing four. And instead of what's in Venice Biennale, I saw a lot of projects where the goal was the design in itself and not the social good. So this is something very, very important. So there is a big open now for social impact design. That's fantastic. But in fact, very, very little result, practically talking, because all the designer as architect or designer are trained to design something for their, I would say, ego. So it's a completely different work. We are designing something and we are just a small bit of a long chain of decision maker. So it's a big change, I think, in the way of thinking design.
Great. And then just the one thing I would add to that is you had heard a couple times the group called the Shelter Cluster, and that's a group of like-minded organizations that have come together in order to deal with shelter, and each one of them will have their shelter departments and would be good entry points to reach out to. Any more suggestions that we can have? We've got 6 minutes left. I think we can take 2 more questions. I know that you had a question earlier that we should certainly take, and then you have one right here in the front. And if we can have more, I know you had your hand raised and there was one further up. We certainly will, but if we could take these 2 questions, and then whatever the responses are, any concluding remarks, you can sort of wrap them in there as well.
Okay,
Please.
thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Patricia Morris, and I worked in humanitarian policy. And I want to build on Rachel's question, actually. As designers with more involvement in humanitarian affairs, it's the humanitarian actors who are left to tackle the political will in countries. And I'm really glad to hear you bring up host communities, because that is an obstacle to your work. It's an obstacle to making these durable solutions that seem just more practical. And so I'd like to hear about how you manage your role in host communities that might negatively view the refugee communities there. And designers' roles, I should say.
Great, thank you. And then we had a question in front. And then maybe we'll take one or two more, and then we'll try to give some justice to the answers when we're done.
I was impressed by the numbers of 300,000 shelters that are made every year, and I'm assuming that your addition to that is minuscule in some sense, and that the majority are gray uniform shelters. Correct me if I'm wrong. And I'm just wondering if there is a reason for the people and the host countries to, as you had your mask, to continue viewing people as uniform, and if there is a will against this kind of individuation, what obviously is beneficial to the people living there. So if you want to provide, let's just say, a private partnership with paint companies and have people put up murals, would that be allowable to have every shelter be that individual, or to plant a garden, or to choose seeds? And in terms of planting trees, which is necessary in many of these places for shade structures, you're also then talking about water supply. And there have been solutions for places, design solution for places with very little water. I was privileged to learn about one from the Global Institute in Saudi Arabia, where they took nomads and provided drip water systems for people to feed the animals with only rains happening once every 5 years. I just wanted to put that out there because it's possible. And the way that they dealt with that with the community was to provide 3D films of what they wanted to build to the community and ask the community's help in building those solutions for themselves. So just wanted to put that out there. My name's Elise Freed, and I have I guess a certificate from IDHA from 20 years ago. Thank you.
Excellent, and we will we'll hold the questions to that, and now we're going to have the difficult challenge. I'm just going to ask each of the panelists. You got about 1 minute, if you could, trying to respond. If you touch on the issue of either host communities, or if Johan, if it's possible for you to go first, if you had any information on the breakdown of the 300,000 shelters, what the other different types were, and what you think, and then maybe we'll just go down along the row. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think that around 300,000 shelters, around 100,000 of them are, prefabs or tents, basically. 200,000 are locally constructed shelters, which look, different. And then not included in these figures are all, I would not know, like the millions of plastic sheets that are distributed in shelter kits. So they're not included in these statistics. So I think that would be the breakdown. If we're looking at sort of color and why are they so gray, I can respond to that because I spent quite some time with trying to get color in our shelters. It's color is culturally sensitive, and we have no idea where we're gonna use the shelters. So there may be a symbol connected to a color. So that's why we had sort of been advised to, there's a lot when you do humanitarian standards, a lot of it, it shouldn't be military colored, it shouldn't be too bright colors, and then you usually have the agencies wanting to have the logotypes and the donors wanting to have the logotypes onto them. There's nothing that the beneficiaries ever had requested. Actually, one of the most popular, the requests we have from organizations is, can we get our logotype onto the shelter? So again, that's another sort of dynamics that we are having. So I would say I don't think that is anything that we want to have them in gray or uniform. I don't think there's in a way. I think on the opposite, I think that humanitarian agencies that I know, they really want to tell the narrative of the refugees as individuals and as families, and there's a lot of good job being done there. I think that this is more of a practical obstacle when you're sort of dealing with solutions at this scale. But again, when you're looking to most, and again, I think we should say we had 70 million refugees today. I think our own research with Better Shelter, we estimate around 10 million of these ones living in these camps that we have seen. So I I think it's just a few, it's very, very small drop.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Johan. Any concluding remarks, Lauren?
I'm working with host communities. What we try to do at USAID is we keep a lot of funding behind to support the host communities. And also with our challenges, we actually work with host community partners as well as affected communities to identify what the right challenge approach is, how we can bring host communities in, how they can benefit from the solutions as well. So we actually just try to create a network and ensure that they're bought in and part of the whole process.
Great, thank you. Jean-Maurice?
Yep. Sorry, I turned around. I have one in.
And
I would
sorry,
say
just and Brendan, if you can indulge us, we're going to go 2 minutes over, but I promise it'll only be 2.
A very good one. I think we know about funding. It's very important to get funding right, but also we think it is very important because in architectural planning you talk about sustainability commercially, sustainability environmentally, and then it needs to be sustainable as well socially. And as you can see, that focus needs to shift towards the social sustainability, because even environmental sustainability carries the word mental health in there. And I think we can do quite a lot about that. And what about the, quickly about the, in the garden, I just wanted to respond to that. Of course, we are aware that it needs to be sustainable, and it doesn't need to be lush green. It can be innovative solutions. It can be also used local plant material, a cacti garden, a dust garden, and others. So we need to move away from our standard of gardening. I think it is very important to understand that, that of course we all aware, regardless, everything needs to be sustainable nowadays, of course, and also recyclable. And my big question back then, maybe you can lose a few words, I asked Johan earlier as well, what is happening to the shelters once a camp will be dismantled? Because there's a lot of material left. Will it be recycled? Will it be moved somewhere else? And I think this is also a point we could make. Maybe we can reuse some of these materials in a different way.
Great, thank you. Raul?
Yeah, I can answer. They will sell it for sure, no problem. It's a good quality. They will reuse it. I mean, we are in it's a very complex reality. So I think there are no one solution. The only things I would like to add is in the global goal, nothing is mentioned about quality and beauty. In the emergency handbook, nothing is really mentioned about quality and beauty. So the only point is that I think that we have, as designer, that kind of designer I'm talking of, we have to be part of the process, because the issue of color is relevant, but it has to be something that the process has to be aware. I mean, to have a tree, it's a big problem in the desert, because the engineer will say, no way, you are not going to use 1 drop of my water. And of course, then you say, well, we can try to recycle the water of the toilet and blah, 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 and this will be very complicated. But it's the point is that that has to be a priority within the process, within the limit of money, the limit of time, security, and all that. It's just a matter that the designer, that kind of awareness has to be inside the process. So that's all.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists. The only comment that I'll add is that we've heard some rich case studies during the last 90 minutes, and this book, Shelter Projects, and I know there were some copies that were out in front. You can also get it online. It's put together every year by the Shelter Cluster, and so lots of different examples from all throughout the world that you can read about and give some feedback about as well. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone. Bye.
You bought a lot of books. Did you bring a book?
No, I don't have any books. I didn't write any books.
You never know what's going to happen.
Oh, yeah.